come once again to discuss things.
Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Geeky Gentlemen. I'm Sid Part 2. Joining me today is...
Geek for fun.
And Steve Baxi.
He said Steve Baxi this time. Usually he only says Steve. That was
My
sweet.
name is so few syllables, I feel like I can go either way.
Yeah. So we're here today to do another Geeky Gentleman review. So Steve, you know how like last week I was like, Steve, it's my bad. I didn't do the calculations right. It wasn't Matt's pick, it was your pick. And you got like really pissed at me and like threw shit and you cursed me out and called my mother a whore.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So it actually wasn't your pick.
God damn it!
It was mine. So I'm gonna take
Today
it.
on this last episode of Geeky Gentleman.
I know.
I quit! I can't work under these conditions.
Oh man. Yeah, so it's just funny. But yeah, so I'll be taking a pick and I don't want to wait 6 more weeks to do a review, so I'm going to take the review topic at the end of this anyway. I'll bring it up with the rules committee to make sure it all checks out real quick. Hold on one sec. Yes, what's up? Yeah, hey, I just had a quick question. I there's this whole situation. It's my bad. Can we do 2 reviews in a row? Motherfucker. This is gonna be like so much paperwork. All right. Let me go ask the boss. Hold on. All right. Yes, fucking jackass. He screwed up, and now he wants to do 2 reviews in 2 reviews in a row. What the fuck? Tell him if he fucks this next one up, I'm having his ass. All right, man. You got the 2 reviews, but like you can't fuck up like that. All right, I'm so sorry. Okay, I'll do it. It'll be fine. Let me go tell the guys. All right. Yeah, guys, everything's fine. There's no problem. 2 reviews. We got this.
Are we reviewing the first place, though?
Yeah. So anyway, it's Steve's topic tonight. Steve, what are we talking about tonight?
So today, we're talking about the 12-issue Maxi Vertigo series by Tom King and Mitch Gerrard's The Sheriff of Babylon. Originally titled The Sheriff of Baghdad, but now The Sheriff of Babylon.
So what made you want to talk about this?
So, I'm a Tom King simp in every sense of the word. I love Tom King comics. I love everything he's ever done. I've been working on some projects that are Tom King related that I will not announce, that required me to go back through and just listen to like all of his old interviews in order, so I just have like this big chronological history of Tom King from podcasts. So I figured, okay, if I'm listening to all this, I better go back and like reread his stuff from the beginning, and so I needed an excuse to reread Sheriff of Babylon. And reading and listening to interviews and stuff with him, there's a lot of interesting history to just kind of go into with this book in general that I kind of want to talk about as we talk about the story itself, like how it got started and how it was originally a novel and where the name comes from and all of that. So I just thought it would be fun to talk about. Also, it's a chance for us to talk about something else that isn't just like a straight up superhero or superhero comic. So there's just a little bit more like range here when we're talking about Iraq and the war on terror and the portrayal of Muslim characters in this. And it's also kind of a spiritual successor to our last 2 topics, because the cover artist for this whole series, Jean-Paul Leon, also died recently.
Oh man, I didn't know that. Yeah, this has been one of those things where like you and I we used to do those Tom King Batman videos, and like we talked at one point about like, oh, we should talk about Sheriff of Babylon because I'd never read it and you had, and you were really interested to talk about it. And then I bought it and it just kind of sat in my pile of to read trades that's just sat there and I've just never really been in the mood for it because it's kind of I knew going in without knowing much about it. Like, I know that it's at least based on or inspired by Tom King's work in the CIA during the Iraq War, and I was like, ooh, that's gonna be a fucking heavy thing. I'm gonna leave that for a time, but now its time has come, and it is not exactly a cheery stroll through the sands now, is it?
Oof.
Yeah.
There's a lot of oofing.
Alfie,
In a good way.
Have you ever read or heard of this before, or is this your first time too?
I have definitely heard of it before. It's something that I didn't know what it was going. I had a completely different idea going into it than what it actually was, which is kind of hilarious.
Knowing you probably thought like the title was gonna be like really, really literal, and it was gonna be about like a sheriff in like old ancient Babylon as they're like building the tower.
Yeah! I was thinking like knights and Pegasuses and like a sheriff among them, like, because that's what that's what your indie comics are, right? I had in my mind, oh, this is like Tom King's Klaus or something. That this is like the sheriff of this ancient town or something ridiculous like that. That was you're 100% on the money on that. Yeah, that's exactly what I thought it was. So it's like, oh yeah, well, the title doesn't really grab me, but I like Tom King's work, so maybe I'll check it out one time. And then obviously get the review, so I go on the Amazon page. I'm just like, oh wait, 2003? Hussein? Nani? And so then I have to get the trade, and I'm just like, yeah, this is not this is not what I expected in any stretch of the word. But I just knew it from reputation of just like, this is the thing that kind of Tom King got put on the map for, like, at least in terms of like a critical sense. This is what Michellard's kind of uses as just like example of why they're such a good storyteller and so great at facial expressions and like a really kind of formative work. That I definitely knew from that, but yeah, I had no idea it was going to be what it was, and how it did what it was, and how far it went, and how real it got, and all of that just completely took my head. Mm-hmm. Very newborn going into this, and I come out a fully grown, bearded man.
Yeah. So the thing that I definitely had a temptation to do, because I know I've talked to Steve about this before, and he's like, "Oh yeah, Tom King had to submit the scripts to the CIA to get approval on what could be released and what couldn't." And so the thing I was very tempted to do, but actively chose not to, was look up to see how much of this was inspired by actual events and how much of this is real. Because, like, there's certain things about it I can 100% believe is true. There's other things where I'm like, okay, if this was actually his experience or in any way, then it would have to be like he has to be making at least this part up, right? So it's very interesting to know that this is connected in some way, shape, or form to his time in the CIA, which gets held over his head like it's by leftist Twitter, like it's some kind of horrible like automatic cancel shaming thing. But he's like, no, I did it. It's not that I'm not proud of my service, but it's like it was pretty messed up, I'll admit. Like, that's kind of the way Tom King talks about it. It's kind of interesting. So I think leftist Twitter just doesn't really know what to do with that, and I guarantee you none of them have read this.
Yeah, so to that point about both leftist Twitter, which can suck it, and about what's real and what's not, there's some gray area there, because I mean there are certain things for sure that probably never happened, like them murdering the dude at the end in the last issue. Like there's no fucking way Tom King took a CIA contractor and just shot him in the head and then left Iraq for good. Like, that did not happen. But then there are other things where when they kill Nasir's wife that feel way too real. Where I'm like, this had to have happened. You don't write this scene if you did not see it. You may not have been involved in the way you were, but this feels very, very real. Or the scene where he thinks the little kid who's selling him a porno video might have like a gun or something on him. Like that stuff feels very genuine and very real. And just based on stuff he said, essentially like issue 7 onward is when things become like really, really close to what his actual experience were, and that's when he gets like panic attacks and fast flashbacks to being in Baghdad at the time. Mitch Gerrard's talked about how like there were certain photo references in this book that just don't exist anymore, because at the time where he would have been in Baghdad, there were certain kinds of structures like the cafe he eats at here that did not exist literally 6 months after because they got blown up. So a lot of the location scouting and stuff like this is actually based in reality, but there's very little like actual photographic evidence of it outside of what Tom King would have had. So that stuff's really interesting and really unique. As far as the leftist Twitter thing goes, this book is part of what's called Tom King's trilogy of best intentions. This is Sheriff of Babylon. Essentially, how this happened was he originally wrote a pitch for Vertigo and for his literary agent at the same time called The Sheriff of Baghdad, and Vertigo said okay, and so he wrote the first script for the first issue, and then something happened at Vertigo and it didn't get published, so he wrote a novel to adapt the whole thing. And then eventually Vertigo was like, okay, now we're ready to publish Sheriff of Babylon or Sheriff of Baghdad. So he made a choice between writing the novel and doing the comic, and he turned it into a comic. So he essentially turned like every couple chapters into basically an issue of the comic. Sheriff of Babylon or Baghdad is the first thing he ever wrote, but it's probably one of the last things to originally come out. And it was originally called Sheriff of Baghdad because the whole idea was essentially just the sort of basic irony, which is he was in Baghdad at a time where there was no law and order. So it's the irony of like what sheriff, what laws, there can be no Sheriff of Baghdad. And they had to change the title because some crazy dude who owns like a mercenary training camp or something like that is named his company the Sheriff of Baghdad. And the only way he would let Tom King use the title is if he like gave him like 50% of the movie rights and commissions on the issues and script approval and all this bullshit. So DC's like, no, just change the fucking title. And so he changed it to Sheriff of Babylon instead. Although he still refers to it as Sheriff of Baghdad sometimes. But essentially the idea behind this book, Omega Men, and The Vision is the protagonist of each story goes into a situation where they're very optimistic and wide-eyed about what they think they can do, and immediately are faced with the reality that they do not understand what world they have entered, and create a much deeper, much more complicated, and much more tragic situation than what they expect. And so in each one of these stories, Kyle Rayner, Vision, and Chris come out of this as people that had the best intentions at heart, but could never actually act on them because there was just too much going on that they did not understand. And that is, in a nutshell, how Tom King views his CIA career, which is 9/11 happens, he puts his law degree on hold, and he puts his comic writing ambitions on hold because he feels like he has to do something, as most people his age would have. And so he decides to join the CIA. He serves 5 months in Baghdad as a CIA officer, going on raids and stuff, essentially being on quarantine for most of it. Decides that he does not want to do this, and this was probably not the best thing in the world, and then serves 5 years as just like working in an office before he quits.
Yeah, and I definitely think a lot of that comes through. Like you were talking about a lot of the traumatic things. The whole scene where they talk about the crosses in the raid definitely sounds like it comes from reality. It's more the stuff like with the characters and everything like that. Like, what is his name? Abu Hamir or something like that?
The essentially the bad guy at the end, Abu Rahim.
Abu Rahim, yeah. Like, him as a character, I'm like, okay, this sounds like a thing that I know I've heard talked about a lot, where, like, there's the reputation of the terrorist mastermind kind of thing. You know, it's funny because there's a scene where two of the the torture guys talk about, oh, have you seen the new season of 24, which was big at the time, and kind of hyped up that idea of like the mythical terrorist ringleader and all that shit. And then you get to like his reveal in the story, and his introduction in the final chapters where he comes in with the vest on and everything. He's like, and now I'm George Washington. Like that feels like something right out of like a proper, Hollywood thriller moment. And so it's hard for me to believe that part of it's real, but more just the way that like everything fizzles out with him, that he's not actually some mastermind with hundreds of operatives at his beck and call, that he's not a James Bond villain. Basically he's just a guy, and a couple of his friends basically were committing terrorist operations because that's all you really needed at the time. And so it's not real. It's not like the big conspiracy everyone wanted it to be. It was just one dude with like a crazy ambition. And I think that's something that, you see even until today. I remember listening to a profile of the Syrian civil war, and it was talking about like the kinds of people fighting it. And it talked about an alliance made between pro-democracy fighters and a guy who wanted to create a new Islamic empire. And it's like, okay, so let's say you guys, storm the castle and take out Assad. Fucking what then? Like, you just immediately, like, Mexican standoff? Like, is that what happens? Because your goals are completely unaligned. And it's just, there's the very American idea of that, like, again, James Bond villain thing, and this creates this shows a subversion of it. But I'd be highly skeptical, or I guess I'd be highly doubtful that, like, the man that we see, the character that we see in the book, is a literal thing that Tom King experienced, and I'd lean more toward it's probably like a kind of scenario Tom King experienced, where they kept thinking they found the big fish, and really there's no big fish in the pond. It's all just a bunch of tiny fish.
Yeah, I think that's a good way, where it's probably not even like meant to be one person, but like an amalgam of, which is what I think this book is. I don't think any one character in this book is meant to be like a stand-in for one individual person. I think they're all meant to be like a collective of the type of people that King met or heard about or read about during his time there, and just in general, just the type of people that kind of situation breeds. And of course, so you'll get like he's very much the trying to seize power, because when there's lawlessness and everything, basically anyone who just so happens to have a couple of guys with a couple of guns can suddenly now become seen as like this big figurehead. And I imagine, because again, you hear stories like, just again, even you can go over to like the UK or America or anywhere, and there's people, just serial killers, who think that they're the second coming, that there's a god or anything. And if you threw them in a place where there's no rules going on, because no one knows what anyone is doing, there's nothing's going on, any authority figures like this, they have no idea, it's just kind of chaos. Of course they could take advantage of that and seem bigger than they were. So I don't even think that's like a kind of situation. I think that's just like, he probably never met one face to face, but he probably spent a lot of time like hearing about different guys like this, who would have like big reputations, but never actually nothing behind it, but just kind of like, again, a couple bullets kind of thing. And I go back to like, again, like we've got Sophia in this, we've got Chris. I don't think any of these are meant to be. Chris is definitely meant to more so, I feel like, be more King himself, but King puts himself in all of his protagonists. That's just what he kind of does as a writer, at least a little bit. And I think that's not necessarily meant to be a representation of him. It's more just like how he felt and how like the people around him felt during this time. Sophia, like, again, like people trying to make change from these kind of things, and the kind of inefficiency of that, and just the general again, the fact that the Sheriff of Babylon title is, like you said, Steve, meant to be ironic, I think is pretty potent, because the whole thing is just, the story in this book doesn't go anywhere, and that can be frustrating. But I think that's the point. It's brutally honest about just that. Yeah, things just happen to people because nobody has a plan. Nobody knows what the fuck is going on. That's what war actually is. War is just a lot of standing around and talking, and then you'll hear a gunshot, and everyone panics, and nobody knows what's going on. And that's that kind of like really hard to capture thing that films and comics and audio dramas and stuff can't do it. But then you watch like some footage, or you'll hear like documentary about like old soldiers talking about it, and that's the closest you can get. And I think the thing this book that struck up to me the most is that it managed to capture that feeling of like an old soldier talking about just like, yeah man, people would just take each other out the back and just shoot an officer in the head that they didn't like, because who was gonna tell them what not to do? No one is keeping track of people in this situation. It's just chaos. There's no sense of duty or a mission or something to be saved. It's just scared people on all sides, not knowing what the fuck is going on.
Yeah, so one of the reasons he likes the title, both as Sheriff of Baghdad and as Sheriff of Babylon, is that the abbreviation is SOBs. He can just call it son of a bitch. Because he thinks that's kind of the essence of what it feels like when you read a lot of these issues, is that you just kind of think son of a bitch, these people or these things. The stuff with Chris, where he's trying to train up this police force of here's going to be the people of law and order after the American military leaves and they essentially rebuild Baghdad. And it's almost this sort of like, I don't even know what the metaphor really is, but it's almost like this myth of Sisyphus kind of thing of just like, you're never going to get anywhere. No matter how much you train these guys, they don't learn. They're not going to process these things. You know a guy who used to be a police officer in Baghdad and it did not work out. You've left no infrastructure in this area for this to in any way work out. So you're filling all of these people's minds with hope of like restoring some kind of order to a situation you have destabilized and now have created where you can never actually leave, or it'll just descend into further chaos. And it's just really infuriating. It's just the boulder rolling down the hill over and over and over again. And there's no way to deal with that aside from just like heady pleasures, like getting drunk outside of an old exploded pool, or like giving candy to the natives because you don't want to scare them, or just like sometimes just like laying on the side, just being like son of a bitch.
Mm-hmm. I gotta find the line from Sophia that I really, really fucking loved, because I think the thing that is just great about it is her take as the here it is, her take as the what would be called in historical context as like the native ally, the person in the country or from the country who is advocating for the invading force to be there and to improve things. And I just love this speech she gives. You and your people fire your mortars and try to scare people by killing grass. Your people take empires with these little bombs here and there. My God, I aimed the greatest army in the world at my enemy and wiped him from the earth. You are George Washington, brother. I am shock and awe. Oh, I fucking love that scene so much.
That's so good.
It's so perfect as like, because there's, oh, poor Leah, she's crying. There's just like this sense of, oh, America's the invaders. No one wanted us there. No one ever wanted us to be there. And like, I mean, certainly the majority didn't. I've heard interviews with Iraqi and Afghani people where they're like, yeah, no, I mean, things are conceptually a little bit better now, but honestly we probably enjoyed more freedom under the other regimes if we just didn't talk about them. They're not a fan, but like there were always people in these countries who wanted change and fought for it and worked for it and stuff. And so I think it's really interesting to see that portrayed in a character. And again, it's hard to say like how much this is a actual person, how much this an amalgamation of people that King knew, because God, she is just doing a lot in this book. She's her introduction is she handed off 3 American soldiers to be killed by Nasir, and then she's also helping Chris get in touch with someone to help him figure out who killed this Iraqi trainee. God, that's such a good freaking use of a character, amalgamation of a character.
I think the general pushback from people with Tom King's work in general, but might even have before reading this book, is the idea that quote-unquote white CIA guy can talk about what it's like to be in Iraq and to write Muslim characters authentically. Just as an Indian dude who grew up in a Middle Eastern country and knows a lot of Muslim people, he's very, very on point with all of his voices, and all of these conversations sound like conversations I've had with Muslim people. Mm-hmm. So that criticism will be loud, but I think he does a very good job of explaining these people from his perspective, and he's not writing about he's not doing the thing I think people rightly complain about, which is, how can Brian Michael Bendis write a coming of age story for a black kid, right? Like that doesn't compute on a certain level, even if he writes him well and he has the best intentions at heart. But King is writing this book from the perspective of a dude in the CIA who was here at the time, and all of these people are representations of the people he met, and for that experience, it is authentic. And as far as the kinds of people of color he's writing, they all, to me, at the very least, sound extremely authentic. And all of their dialogue, like even just the way they arrange words and the sort of like broken speech patterns between the English, between when they're speaking in their language and when they're speaking in English, they all sound very, very authentic, and they all sound very realistic. This isn't even like the sort of like standard Tom King dialogue where it sounds like people are speaking in poetry. Like, this sounds like actual conversations.
I mean, I think it does sound a little like your standard Tom King dialogue. He's definitely fond of his tricks of like characters telling stories that seem completely unrelated to the thing, but then that's the whole point of the book. Like, that's the moral is the little story someone tells along the way. Like, I really like that. I like when we get Sophia's origin. It's like, so I was taken to America, and there they called me Sophia, and it is a name that I am ashamed of, and I am Sophia. I love that bit where we get like the history of what the name means. I thought that was really, really cool. One thing I do want to talk about a little bit too is the way that Gerard draws all of this stuff. I think he does just an absolutely incredible job of capturing the like reality of this, because you're I guess the example I'll do is I'll shit on Clay Mann for a little bit, because this is like a deserved criticism I feel of Heroes in Crisis. Is like this really big, emotionally important superhero story, but then Clay Mann's there and he's just drawing like boob pockets on the female characters as they're like bearing their souls, and it just looks like your classic superhero comic proportions, and it's very distracting from the emotional reality of the story. Whereas this is just, everyone looks so genuinely like human. Like there's no exaggerated bodies. Like, Sophia looks beautiful under certain contexts, and then in other ones she looks just goddamn miserable. And I think that's just really great, because it shows you like that range of humanity of like how you're feeling can affect like how you appear. I think Nasir has a really good like representation and build. He's like kind of fat middle-aged guy, and you see him kind of go through hell. You see the CIA like torture him and leave him naked and tie him to a chair and put a bag over his head and like drag him out of the desert and say, we're gonna kill you here unless you tell us what we want to know. I'm sure that part was inspired by real events. That sounds like some CIA shit to me. But like that one, I thought just the way that he was portrayed and visualized looked like just very, very genuinely human. And I think that goes for everyone in the book. I thought the art did a great job of just capturing the tone of the story, but also in giving the characters a lot more humanity than they might otherwise have under a different artist.
And I think the thing I want to kind of, I don't know, I wouldn't say this as a criticism, because it's still very good. I wanna do it like to praise, like I guess like the even further glow up is going from recently like reading like Strange Adventures to this. I can definitely tell that this is Gerard's earlier work, especially like the coloring. But like even again, like when like your I don't know Gerard's career in terms of when they started out as a comic book writer, but like this is still like top quality, like high quality work. But the fact that they've kept getting better to the point where Strange Adventures looks like almost a completely different artist in how the colors went out and like the characters are depicted, but like it's still that you can still tell that the faces are drawn very realistically, and the strength of him is definitely being able to show like different emotions of the characters, like you mentioned, Ian. Like the different effects that Gerard's will use, like when they're in that scene in the finale, where we've got like the painting on the wall, and the painting doesn't have any line work. The painting's like given a different filter and stuff. When we're doing the sniper point of view, it's shot as if you've got like night vision with how it's colored and everything like that. I think Gerard's has done like a really great masterclass of like one of the top comic book colorists, not even just as a penciler, but the fact that they're both is kind of insane. The fact that they just do the whole thing themselves, I think, is really, really inspiring and really impressive. So that's something that struck out to me as I was reading this. Is it was like it's definitely distinctly Gerard's, but there's like almost like a rawness to it that I think suits the subject matter. Obviously, you can't have like great like blowing, majestic shots of like fucking capes flowing when you're dealing in like the war in Iraq. So like, there's a lot of browns and a lot of like dark hues to capture that tone, to capture that feeling. But there's still moments of like where they're just sitting around, and there's that great issue where Fatima and Chris just like have that talk about like just they get drunk and they just talk about life. There's like a real beauty to that. There's like a real like stillness. There's a real like the colors and the night and everything, and then the brightness of the day. Like it really helps capture the even in like such a place where like there's it feels like there's no hope or anything. As long as you've got like a good friend to talk to, it's like you can find like peace. You can find like some mild joy. And obviously when she gets shot in such a horrific way later on, it makes it all the more tragic when you have those little moments of levity, when you have not everything is just crushingly dark. You can still find like these people will make jokes, these people will laugh and cry, and like you get the full gambit here. I think a lot of people who negatively talk about Tom King, and he's leaned into it, and I certainly do the joke myself of like Tom King stories of people about like looking out in the rain, looking sadly and stuff. I think people forget like just how funny he is. Just like how like even in something like this, like it's so horrific sometimes that you just can't help but laugh. Like there's an absurdness to the reality of these things. Like when they're talking about the guy who like the throat slit incident, right? And then the two guys are like, hey, it's got to be the same guy. It's got to be the same guy. And then the way the Iraqi police officer, the police captain, he goes for, and he's like, oh yeah, well the knife was cut the wrong way. You can tell because of this. And they're like, oh yeah, you're right. That obviously that's what I know. That's what I know. And he goes like, yeah, I don't know what fucking way a knife's cut, but like I knew they all watch CSI, so like it's the easiest conversation to get him off that I know the fact that he doesn't look like an Iraqi man. But I think that's really, really funny. I think that's really, really. But there's little moments like that here and there in this, which is like, again, you're in such a horrible situation, but like some of just the sheer incompetency of the people around you that cause that, kind of just have to laugh at it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think my favorite issue in the whole book is the one where him and Fatima get drunk and they're talking about some heavy shit, and Jared draws really interesting ways to like break that up where apparently it's actually his idea a lot of the time when two characters are in the same scene and they cross panels with each other and there's still a gutter, because apparently Tom King will write like scripts that are like 7 panels, and he will either like distill them down into 6 or break them up into 9, and that's how he does it, which is kind of entertaining. But his art choices in here where he like has really small subtle motion lines and stuff where like when Chris is talking with his hands and the way he's like depicting them as drunk with a little bit of like the bubbles around their faces and stuff, it's really pleasant to sit and read, and you get through that issue and these two have bonded and you get like this nice sort of family vibe between the two, and then immediately next issue all the heavy shit hits, and it hits harder because you see these people not even necessarily as like idealizations or stand-ins for certain personality types, but just as like real people in a shitty situation that have bonded over the sort of mutual shittiness of it. Something else King's talked about is there's a tendency to think about Americans and people in Iraq as like different kinds of human experiences, where like, well, you know, they think about conflict differently because of their culture, or they think about their government differently. And he says in his experience with the people he's talked to, that's not true at all. Everyone has very similar understandings and struggles and ideas of what it means to be human. And those are just things we say in order to justify the distance. And I think he absolutely proves that in that issue in particular, where these two people who socio-politically should have nothing in common bond over just talking to each other over a very human kind of trauma.
Mm-hmm. I also found it was interesting the backstory he gave to Chris as a character. He's like, oh, I was a cop and I wrote a warning to one of the 9/11 hijackers. And it's like, it's funny because that's in issue 1 of the series, where it's like, hey, you know, all this, the buildings, all that was because of me. And that like just is an immediate hook, and kind of finally gets paid off later on. It's like, of course it's not because of you. You were doing your job, and you didn't go crazy with it. But it's like, of course that would be the kind of thing that someone in that situation would be like obsessed with, and you kind of get that as a good window into the guilt and into that need to serve kind of thing that really went through post 9/11. So it was very, very interesting to see that portrayed via Chris's character here.
Yeah, I mean it's one of those things where he comes off as almost like an author stand-in, but then you know there's quite a bit of stuff that just isn't true between the two, so you don't want to like just assume that Chris's experience was Tom King's experience. But he writes him in like a very sort of natural way, where it seems like all the time, every time you're supposed to be disturbed, every time you're supposed to kind of get that dramatic effect of like this is a traumatizing thing you're witnessing, it's always through his eyes. My favorite, I mentioned it earlier, was the one where Fatima gets shot and he's in that situation where he's trying to protect Nasir, and he's like, let me call my guys, we can verify that he's supposed to be here, put your weapons down. Like he literally just has like this assertive panic mode where he's like just trying to solve this problem before it escalates, because you know exactly what's going to happen if it escalates, and he just isn't able to. And I don't know, at least to me, that read is almost too real to fake. Even if it didn't happen specifically to him, I feel like he had to have been in that moment.
That was one of the things that really stood out to me. The other one was just the kind of the awkwardness of Chris felt very Tom King-esque, because Tom King doesn't strike me, and certainly the way he acts online and stuff never really feels like he's a very assertive, very commanding person. And so like when you have Chris's opening scene with the trainees, and he's trying to, you know, get them and you know, get them in order, and you need kind of like that Full Metal Jacket army drill instructor kind of presence, and he just has no one's doing anything right. Okay, let's just take 5 and we'll come back or I guess not 5. We'll come back when we're done. Okay, it's the least commanding kind of personality, worst person for that job, and I can absolutely believe that there are government contractors that were doing that. But it was really funny to see that, and that felt very King-esque, like he was put in charge of a situation at least similar to that. Again, you don't want to read too much into it, because you know what, Tom King wasn't a police officer before he joined the military, so therefore yeah. Though if we want to talk comedy for a sec to wrap point back, Tom King has such a great way of writing a absolute fucking asshole who is oblivious to the fact they are an asshole. Like, that is just he does that character dynamic so well. Like, the fucking guy that Chris is talking to, who's the secret agent, we don't even know what branch of the military he works for. And he's just going through and giving us all the backstory. He becomes Mr. Exposition, but he's just such a fucking asshole the whole time. Oh, man. I hate that guy, and I love reading him because I hate him so much.
It's actually... Go ahead,
Go ahead.
I was going to say, it's really funny because I'm going to say at this point, because I'm the one who was forgetting the names during this review, so, like, what does that say about me? But there's a really good touch where, like, again, like, whenever he talks about someone, he doesn't remember the name, he just talks about, like, the guy, the woman that got shot. Like, he doesn't view these things as people, he views them as just, like, events, and like that like pure desensitized to anything but like his career. Like, but this is gonna be the one. Now I've got this guy. Like, I'm the one who did this, and you know that was me who did that. Really, like, you know, I get all the credit. Like, it's you know, people like that. You know, you've seen people like that on the news and in your real life and everything. It's such a... I don't understand it. I really don't. But like, there's such a pure realistic way to writing a douchebag that can be easy to get to, like, the point of parody, and the way he writes it is just so ridiculously awful. You're just like, what the fuck is this dude doing? And there's definitely some parts of it meant to be played for laughs, but it's never portrayed in a way like he's a caricature or anything. He's like, no, I really do believe that Tom King has met this guy or multiple versions of this guy who worked in the Secret Service, like, without a doubt.
The most cathartic of those kinds of characters to me was the old dude who they kill at the end of the story, where they've got the plan to capture Abu after they meet him, and so this guy in, like, the fucking red shirt who's just old shows up and thanks everybody and shakes their hand and is like, you're doing a great job, yada yada yada, and then disappears out of fucking nowhere. And at the end of the story, he comes back and Chris is sitting on his table, and he's basically gets him to confess that, like, yeah, no, he has no power, he's a nobody, he's literally just hired to do that, to make people feel better about themselves. And when they kill him at the end, I don't know, that felt like the most cathartic thing on the planet, because I know for a fact that those people exist. I've never had to deal with them, obviously, but I can imagine, like, if that is entirely your job and people are onto you for that, it would be the most condescending bullshit of all time.
Grey hair. They pick me just because I look old. It's not even that he's old. He just
it just looks old.
Because when he starts talking as if, like, again, like, what he says is basically tech support. and then when we get into like when you first portray him, you almost imagine when you had like the voice in his head of what he's portraying. You imagine almost like a Longhorn, like, well, I say, oh boy, we're gonna get them goddamn terrorists, like, you know, like he looks like an American politician.
He looks like Jeb Bush. That's who I thought it was for a second.
But then that's like the point, isn't it? Is it just it goes into kind of like even the guys that are actually that guy, like that are actually the rich people who do look and act like that. They aren't real. Like that's not a real human being. That is just someone who has become so a tool, a figure that they don't even exist in the way that a human being exists anymore, kind of thing. Like that's what Trump is. He's not a human being at that point. He's just a fucking sock puppet kind of touch. So even if this guy isn't that stereotype, and like, there are people who just pretend to be that stereotype, I don't even think like that's King saying, oh, but the King's denying that these people really do exist. He's like, no, he's not. He's saying that even the ones that do are a fucking condescending joke that don't exist. like it's really it's a really kind of powerful and kind of like, again, melancholic way to end the book, because it's not that, oh, they end the book and they got the guy who was really doing it. They don't. They end the book and they get someone who had nothing to do with it, but just shooting it, I guess, made them feel better at the moment. Because like he is the man who was there, like he's the guy they got, so well we're here, we might as well shoot you, kind of thing. And again, that's not meant to be like this fist in the air thing, but there is like a, I don't know, I didn't get as much satisfaction out of that the way you described, Steve, but I definitely did get the like I don't know, hollow feeling from it, and just the kind of like the pointlessness of it, the point like this, just like, again, like no matter what you do, the Hollywood like you finally catch the bad guy and shoot him thing is just not something that happens in real life. That's just not what is to do. So I really like that we didn't do that. We just like we didn't have the soldier at the end actually did like catch, like even if it was like an American government like thing, did even catch them and do it, because like there's no way that would happen. It's just that's an institution at that point, and you can't fight that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
How did you guys, because I'm curious, since it's such a meme thing at this point with him, but how did you guys feel about the sort of repeated 9-panel grids throughout this comic? Because this is, I think, it's like sequentially the first time he does it as far as writing, even if it's not the first time that we see it.
I liked it. I don't put as much thought into the 9-panel grid as you do, Steve. I kind of just, I guess I just see it as utility more than anything, because it lets you just do, what was it? Strip Panel Naked talked about it really well, where they talked about it as almost like a joke, where it's like setup, pause, punchline, and the 9-panel grid just functions really well to do that with, to just get a point, a counterpoint, a conclusion. It just works really well as like a little 3-act structures throughout the entire book, page by page, panel line by panel line. So I just kind of see it that way. I don't really put much thought into like its story purpose or the idea of like I know in Omega Man it's brought up as the idea of like escaping prison kind of thing. But the way that it works for utility, I always find pretty impressive. He's gotten really good at scripting for it, or Gerard's has gotten really good at drawing it. It's hard to say because he likes to do it out when he's not working with Gerard's as well, so I never know where to place it.
For me, I can't, again, as I'm learning more and trying to do more comic book work myself, I have like put more time into like looking at how panel grids work and like the thought behind them. And I will say, like, if I was to give like it's not even a weakness, because this entire book is really, really good, I definitely feel this is the one that feels the most to me like we really liked Watchmen. Like, this is the one that feels the most to me that, again, especially I didn't know this until you said it, Steve, but the fact that this was the first thing that King wrote is like I could tell, because they get much better at doing it later on. They don't get as much like they use it in smarter ways. They use it in ways that are benefiting the greater story. They use it in like new tricks on it. They kind of break it down and remold it and like configure it in all these different like inspiring like creative ways, and like that's why King uses it so much. He's kind of become like a master at it. This definitely feels to me like I liked how that looks, I like how that reads, and like again, like Ian said, at the utility point. And I think not that that's all the thought that went into it, because I think King maybe even overthinks that work sometimes. And Gerard's definitely always been a fantastic artist, but it did feel the most like this is their most basic execution of it. This is the one where there's not really much to talk about in relation to the rest of the story. It didn't need to have them. They're nice that they're there, but like again, it's more just like a these are the comics I like, so I'm going to borrow stuff from it because this is how I script things. Like again, there's a lot of Darwin Cook in how they use the 3-panel grids, where it's just like the 3 long panels to the side. There's some Miller in like the cutaway interviews. I feel like with like Dark Knight Returns as well. So like this feels definitely much like King at his most kind of raw, just like using all of his different influences to try and tell this story, but not quite being where he will be as like a master. Like it's the training he picks up the sword versus like the master samurai is what I'm gonna compare it to.
You fucking weeb.
Yeah, exactly.
To bridge off of the weeb point, I think there is some actual manga-ness to how he uses it. But yeah, I'm sort of between you guys on it, because of the first trilogy between this, Omega Men, and Vision, I think Vision uses it the best. Omega Men is more deliberate, but I think a little overthought, and this is the one that's maybe the least thought. Not in a way where he didn't think about it, but it's definitely the one where I feel like it probably needed the least. Ian's right. There is kind of like utility to the way it functions, because every row is essentially like one sequence or one scene. So there's
because you could almost like publish it in like a newspaper like that if you needed to.
Well, yeah. Because old newspaper comic strips, old Peanuts and stuff would use 3-panel grids. Garfield used 3-panel grids just because like they lend themselves to jokes. They have a natural rhythm to it, and so the idea is usually you get 9 panels per page, which means you can dump a lot of information into one page. You have a center panel, which can become sort of like the focus point of the whole scene. You have the last panel, which becomes your transition into the next scene really easily. And then each row is essentially telling its own kind of mini story with the amount of exposition you can dump on here. And because this is a Vertigo book and you're allowed to have characters just talking for pages on end, and you don't need action sequences, it's probably the best way to sort of break up the dialogue. So you're not just reading one giant balloon in one panel. You can kind of shift out the facial expressions and stuff. And a lot of that credit goes to the art for making it look visually interesting. The parts where it's the best, though, I think, are where it's more like manga. And there's a lot of differences between manga and American comics. I'm not gonna try to oversimplify it, but I think one of oversimplified difference between manga and American comics is American comics time skip way more between gutters than manga does. Where in a manga you'll have a panel of a scene, and the next panel is like a zoom in of that scene, and the third panel is like a zoom in on the thing you're supposed to be looking at before the story starts. And American comics will have like a panel, and then you'll just skip a significant amount of time before the next panel compared to manga. And King kind of pulls the manga approach in this, where there will be 9-panel grids in this, where it's just a character kind of silently doing something, like the page where Sophia has been bleeding more because of the miscarriage, and you see the time clock, and you see her on the toilet, and then you see the tampon with the excess blood on it, and that sequence is very, very little time throughout that page. Like, that whole page in real life would probably not be more than like a couple seconds, but he elongates that moment out and creates individual beats for every single aspect of it, so it lingers more and it has almost that manga effect. And I like that a lot. And that's not a thing he, as far as I can remember, that's not a thing he does as much in his sort of second phase of work, and he doesn't do it at all in his third phase of work. But I think it works really well here, especially because you're telling a story about trauma. So being stuck on individual moments that feel like eternity makes more sense here.
Steve, let me throw this at you while we're on the topic, because I think it just came to me. You're the expert, so you'll be able to tell me if we're full of shit or not. Does Tom King write dialogue scenes like a mangaka writes fight scenes?
How does a mangaka write fight scenes?
So, like, because I've read this because I've been reading, like, some Dragon Ball things now and again. It just kind of struck me, the comparison, when you were talking about it. So, you know, in Dragon Ball, there'll just be a chapter, and it doesn't just extend to that, like in Bleach or anything. There'll just be a chapter of a fight. And, like, that's kind of, like, unheard of in comics. And like, the screen transitions won't be, like, a long period between the fights. It's, like, the next panel will be the next punch, and then punch, 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 and then page turn. Punch, punch, punch. Like, it's just beat to beat to beat. You know what reminded me was reading it was like, wait a minute, because you just mentioned it. It's like, that's how Tom King writes, like, dialogue scenes that in another book would be like a page at most, but he'll just let them go on for like 6 pages, and it's just the same dialogue scene. Is he writes it like a mangaka just sits on the fight? Like, you'll get an entire issue and it's just that dialogue scene.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely what's going on there. I was just confused for a second because I wasn't sure what you were talking about with manga, but yeah, that makes sense. No, so the other thing that the 9-panel grid does really, really well is that it isolates people into their boxes, because you really can't functionally or practically draw more than one person in the scene, especially if you're going to have dialogue. And it makes a single moment into a single beat. And so you'll have instances in this book and in a lot of his other work that I really like, where you'll have one scene of like just 2 characters on a sofa, but that one panel of the 2 people sitting on a sofa will be spliced between 3 panels, and the gutters will still be there. And this is something he does in Mr. Miracle a lot. And the idea is essentially like, yeah, you could functionally just have one panel with 2 sets of dialogue, one for the character on one end of the couch and one for the character on the other end of the couch, and then just go to the next moment. But instead, he breaks them down so that every aspect of the conversation is its own individual beat. First, Scott says something, then you nudge over and look at the other person, and then the other person says something. And so there's one, like, an immediate isolating effect and a distance created between the 2 people, because that gutter is literally there. There is literally a boundary between these 2 people talking to each other, so there's an emotional distance. But also, everything they're saying is contained inside of its own beat. So Scott, Free, or in this book, Chris will say something, and you just hang on him saying it, and then the next moment is someone else is saying something. And so instead of the dialogue feeling like it's responding to each other, it feels like each individual instance of dialogue is deliberate and punctuated by its own moment. And that makes a lot of sense, especially when you have characters that, sort of like in most Tom King books, almost feel like they're talking past each other, because they're having thematically the same conversation, but content-wise, it doesn't always sound like these 2 people are naturally responding to each other. And that gets kind of enhanced because they're not necessarily responding to each other, and there's an emotional distance with the way they're drawn on the page, and the gutter is there, but then thematically it's all kind of connecting back to each other after the conversation has wrapped. And that's because each individual aspect of the conversation is its own narrative beat. So yeah, no, it's exactly like a manga fight scene where, like, every punch is telling its own story independent of the fight itself.
Yeah, it's spot on. I'm glad I'm not just losing my mind on that because I just remembered it. Just again, it's like, it's such a weird comparison to say this hard-hitting, political, like, real life take stories. Oh, this reads like Dragon Ball. But like low-key, some kind of pages, like the beats, it kind of does. Where, like, again, obviously a punch thrown is much quicker to skim through than like when you have to sit down and pay attention to the dialogue. But like in terms of like how your eye moves across the page, where like you look at one panel, look at the one panel, and as you're doing it, it creates this nice visual of the scene in your head. I think is something that is underutilized in comics. yes, it's something that you have to do well, otherwise you can just tank your pacing, but I feel like we're in a rush to always get to the next thing and kind of cram as much worth as we can in 22 pages, or the opposite effect where we do the Bendis thing where like we get basically nothing done in 22 pages. I think this strikes a really nice balance where you can have a lot of information come at you at once, but then you can also slow down and spend like 4 pages on just a phone conversation.
Oh yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right there, and I think the manga approach for someone like Tom King makes a lot of sense compared to other writers that tend to have different focuses as far as like talking about action or letting the art do most of the work. I think, to be honest, a lot of this actually comes from Tim Seeley, because Tim Seeley is, I don't know how big of a manga fan he is, but he is very, very aware and talks a lot about manga, and he teaches manga at Columbia, and Columbia is also where Tom King went to school, funny enough. But the way this book was originally conceived, he wrote the first issue, Vertigo accepted it, nothing happened. He got to write Grayson with Tim Seeley, and then he came back and was able to write the series at Vertigo. And so Tim Seeley was the guy who was basically in charge of training Tom King on how to write a comic book. And I got to imagine some of that Tim Seeley influence was write it like manga, or maybe not exactly in those words, but like isolating those individual beats, like taking the action scenes and breaking them down into more small individual things. And Tom King doesn't even like writing action scenes because he thinks characters should not be talking while they're trying to punch each other, and so he's trying to create the exact same effect when they're not punching each other.
It's really funny. That's stuff that maybe he should throw it in the towel. He should do it more because he's clearly very good at it in pacing wise. Maybe he should just write a fight comic next to really kind of change it up a little bit. He's got the beat to beat down. But no, back to this thing. In general and outside of my weird little tangents on that, the actual pacing of this story I thought was really interesting because like, does it feel to you that there's like, as it starts off, it feels like almost it's going to be like this separate kind of episodic thing, where like different POV from characters and different things at first, to me at least, because I'm stupid, didn't feel like they were connected. It just felt like we were going to different places of the world and different things would happen over time.
And then we were going to see the dragon and the Babylonian sheriff and everything. Like, you see, it was going to start in 2003, but then flash back to when Babylon did have a sheriff.
Yeah. It would be good still, because King would find a way to make it work, so... Ironically, there's still slaps. But anyway... But then as we kept going, it felt like we were, and the characters met each other, and we met up to things, things came to place a little bit more. And just in my reading for this is like, Steve, you said there's a plan for like, to have like, this wasn't meant to be a one-off, there's like a season 2 for this?
Yes, season 2 is entirely written. I don't know if it will ever happen. The way Tom King talked about this very early in his career, back in like 2015 and 16, is he said he wanted Sheriff of Babylon to be his like 60-issue Vertigo Preacher style like run. The first issue itself takes a lot of references from stuff like Why the Last Man, and he straight up steals the whole black panel with a bang thing from Brian K. Vaughan. And it was supposed to be in that vein. And he wrote season 1, and then him and Mitch decided to take a little bit of a break after the first season was done. And the second season was supposed to be almost like True Detective style, new season, new cast, yada yada. And it didn't happen, even though all of it's been written. I imagine the reason it didn't happen is because he says his contract with Sheriff is the same contract as Alan Moore with Watchmen, which means him and Mitch do not own it if the book sells. And so this book will never go out of print, so they can never have the rights back to it. Which is probably why there hasn't been a season 2, because he's probably like working on his options as far as like actually owning the story about his experiences in the CIA. But
well, I mean, I'd be surprised if this stays in print the way Watchmen does. Like, I have a hard time finding this. I think I only found it... Yeah, if I remember correctly, I got my copies at a used bookstore. I'd be surprised if this is even still in print now, and if that's still going. Because isn't that, if it's the exact same Watchmen contract, then DC can never not have it in print. So I don't know what the situation with that is.
Yeah, I don't know the details on that. The version I have is the deluxe edition hardcover that came out this year. Mm-hmm. So that one might have now extended its print run, but there might be another printing planned or something like that. But essentially the way it goes is as long as people are able to buy it, he cannot own it. And originally, apparently, the entire rights were supposed to go to Tom King, but he basically offered as a way to get Mitch Gerard to work on it to say Mitch can also own it. So that's why they both have a stake in it now, and he's probably not going to do any more unless he can do more with him. If season 2 is written, I imagine we will see it eventually, but I guess it just all depends on how much he wants to finagle that contract or not.
Yeah, no, I think unlike Watchmen, that's like this big seminal work, this is a really, really good comic, obviously, but I'd be surprised if this stays in print for more than a couple of years. I'm surprised they released a deluxe edition. I probably shouldn't be. DC's kind of notorious for that, but after that, I don't know what the like timeline is. Maybe it has to be like out of print for more than 5 years or something. But I'd be absolutely shocked.
Thing is like the Watchmen thing happens the way it is because Watchmen became Watchmen. You know, like Watchmen was the thing that just. It's never going out of print because it's kind of like a benchmark of the entire industry kind of thing. Like it became bigger than more. This is a really good book, but this is certainly not bigger than Tom King. This only probably got a reprint because Tom King's name is bigger now, you know, because he's kind of thing. So I don't know. Again, that's still like a not good situation, but. I like to think at least that
don't take that contract, up and coming writers.
Yeah, exactly. But like, it's something where I feel like King is, quite frankly, a smarter business person than Alan Moore is. So I think like whatever happens with it, he'll probably find a way to sort it out in a way that keeps him comfortable, and we'll find like some kind of middle ground or anything. I don't think. He's certainly not retired to Glasgow and going to go pout for the rest of his life, you know? Like, he's treating it like
Alfie, don't. Alan Moore is a good guy. Why are you being so mean to him? We don't do that on this show. We don't take every opportunity to just make fun of Alan Moore, alright? The man's been through enough.
I was out of line. I've been having a day, you know, so... I'm sorry for crossing that Geeky gentleman boundary, and that's on me. So
you know, I'm just saying, like, the man's done nothing wrong ever. He's a saint and a treasure. That's all I got. Anyway, so yeah, I don't know. It's definitely an interesting book. I'm certainly in no hurry for season 2. Like I said, I bought this probably at least 2 years ago and just now read it for the first time, and I'll be honest, I don't see myself picking this back up again anytime soon, because it is such a heavy read. Like I haven't picked up Vision again, you know, like it's a very, very good book, but it is a heavy read, so it's going to be a while till I go back to that one. Yeah, I mean, if he does it, I will eventually read it in that you know, years later kind of sense, probably. But I would certainly be interested in seeing it because it's fascinating to see someone kind of, you know, take these real life experiences, and I feel this shows a side of the. Like, this feels very much, you know, I mentioned Full Metal Jacket earlier. This feels very much in that vein, which I don't think the Iraq and Afghanistan wars really got that level of treatment, at least not yet, of like reflecting upon them and making art about what those wars were.
It's tough because
They're
much
still
of it
going.
went on for so long, and like to an extent, it's still going on, and so you're kind of like waiting for the period of like, okay, now we can sort of take a pause and a breather from this cruel situation we've found ourselves in, and kind of reflect on it with good art. But then it just keeps going and keeps going, so it's hard to find that break.
Mm-hmm. I mean, again, it's always scary when the Onion's right, you know, and there's that Onion article is like freaking soldier excited to serve in the same war his father fought in. And it's like, man, that is tacular right there.
Jesus.
To your earlier point about like training the military, obviously this is about Iraq and not Afghanistan. You know, I think in the public conscious they're kind of interchangeable at this point, but obviously this is about Iraq and not Afghanistan. But I was listening to a story today about Afghanistan and what its political situation has been like over the last couple months as the U.S. Plans to withdraw for the 15th billionth time, it feels like, and they're talking about how the Taliban has like completely reinstated political control over large portions of the country, and like even the portions that they haven't taken control over, like big major cities, they've taken control of all the rural areas surrounding said cities. And I'm just sitting here thinking, man, if only we stayed a couple more years, I'm sure everything would be fine.
I don't know about you guys, but like, I mean, Ian, you sort of mentioned the heaviness of it, but you're also more of a history buff than at least me. But I'm not the kind of person that likes war stories very often, and I certainly don't care for most of anything to do with war on terror stuff, because I think it's almost always just bad or misrepresentative or just flat out racist and wrong in a lot of ways. So this book is absolutely not for me, and yet I still did end up really enjoying it just because I really like Tom King. But like, is independent of the weightiness, is this the kind of thing you guys like to read when you're thinking about like historical fiction?
To some extent. To some extent, yeah. I like things that, take that back, that step away kind of portrayal, because there's usually, when we talk about media of historical events that are going on, there's usually like media created at the very beginning that is almost like it's hard to not call it propaganda, because it's either propaganda for or against the thing to try to get it like nipped in the bud and either end it quickly one way or the other. Then as the thing goes on, there's usually stuff created during it, but if the thing doesn't go on for incredibly long, it's hard to really get that to happen. And so that kind of falls into a gray area. And then there's stuff that's made after it, and that's usually when things get interesting, because you've got that historical distance now. You can kind of reflect on what was it really about, what was really happening. And I think this does a really good job of reflecting on what was it really about, what was really happening, and the fact that the reason that the United States was in Iraq was to fight something that wasn't there, which is the idea of the terrorist boogeyman, the super smart 24 villain. Like that's kind of what it was sold on, is, oh yeah, Saddam's got weapons of mass destruction and he's protecting the ringleaders of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and all these other, big scary terrorist organizations that want to come to Fort Wayne and blow up the roller dome. Real thing, the Fort Wayne roller dome, which is a area for roller skating, was on the terrorist attack watch list. It's just, I'm not lying, Steve. But like that's
I believe
like,
you, sadly.
the idea like that boogeyman was like the reason that was the war was sold, was the idea of the boogeyman, and the thing that was kind of discovered throughout the war is
Saddam Hussein didn't have weapons of mass destruction. He had them in the 90s, and he used all of them, and that was it. That was Saddam Hussein's show of force. It was his... I hate to talk about one historical thing and then tangent off to another historical thing, because eventually I'll be sitting here talking about fucking fish. But, so America makes 3 nuclear weapons at the end of World War II. They make one and they test it in New Mexico to make sure the concept works. It does. They have the other 2 and they drop them on Hiroshima and Nagasaki respectively. And the first bomb gets dropped on Japan. They call the leaders of Japan and say, surrender now. Or what happened to this city will happen to another. And they go like, what do you mean what happened to this city? Like, oh, we'll go there because apparently no one survived to tell you. And they go and they see the destruction, like, holy shit. And then they drop another because Japan didn't surrender. And then they go, surrender now or we will keep doing this. And it was a bluff because America didn't have any more. They didn't have any more nuclear bombs. And they were really, really hoping that Japan would surrender at that point. And they look, for whatever, luckily, I guess, is maybe the wrong word, but they did. And so Saddam Hussein's use of weapons of mass destruction in the 90s, which is a confirmed thing that happened, was what the Gulf War was about. That was his version of that. That was his bluff of use the thing once, and then everyone will fear that I've always got these. And it worked too well, in some respects. And so then the war kind of kicks off there, and things just get crazier and crazier, and you just slowly realize the implications of what happens when a war was, like, completely a lie. Like, there's sometimes where, like, the shit is an exaggeration, or it got blown out of proportion, but it was like the entire war was nothing. None of it was real, and yet the war happened anyway. And so that's kind of the interesting thing that you're left to reflect on. So like the terrorist boogeyman isn't real. It's just a guy who did a violent act. Really, it's the kind of problem that the cops should be dealing with, not a whole fucking army. But there's no cops, there's no law, because the whole situation is just destabilized. And then the big boss man, the government figure who you don't even get to know his name, he just comes in to tell you you're doing a good job. Even he's not real. He's just someone that they bring in to make you feel good. And everything's just so fucking crazy. So yeah, I thought it was a very, very interesting depiction and way to represent the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. This is exactly the kind of tone that I like historical fiction to do with. This would be a very good movie. I'd watch a film adaptation of this.
I wouldn't even say it'd be a movie. I think you can make this into the word King using for like Caesar. I think is very apt. Mm-hmm. I think this works very well as like a TV miniseries. I think would fit.
I wonder if that one guy would sue if they did it.
As long as they don't call it Sheriff of Baghdad, they'll be all right.
Yeah, exactly. We'll see. 24 reference might have to go, but we'll see. No, I think that when I go to like historical fiction, I normally like it to be very honest and be very truthful, even if it's not honest about the events, but honest from the writer about what they think of the things. I don't want to read through like a stat sheet or anything, because I can just watch like a video about that, or I can just read that up on my own time. If I want to see like the story of an event, I want to really get to, like, the emotions of it, and like you can never truly grasp this, obviously, but like the best writers know how to put their emotions onto the page, and then when you pick that comic up or you pick that movie or whatever, it's like transferred to you. Like you can feel a little bit of that hurt, you can feel a little bit of that sadness, you can feel a little bit of that joy. It's like kind of the beauty and the power of the medium. is that you can turn tears into ink and then into tears again. It's like a transitive poverty. So I think King's one of those writers who really does a fantastic job of like, this is how it felt for me as best as I can describe it, and I'm gonna execute and use my skills as a writer and my wonderful collaborators who's just fantastic at their job with the artistic power. I'm going to use that to try and make you feel that as much as I can. And obviously you can never capture it truly, but like, I think this book does a really good job, and the best historical fiction does the best job of like letting you just sit for a moment after you've read it and be like, Jesus. Like it's like and even the ones that are like happy or anything, like you can just, it truly does transport you to another world, to another time, to another state of being, just to imagine yourself in these situations. I think it's really, really powerful, and a really needed endeavor. But people should write about their experiences like these and put it into things, and people like Tom King should write these stories. Him specifically would be a unique example, but like this is why we shouldn't like keep it as much as we can, because like if you can feel someone else's perspective and they can share that as powerful as they can, then you just learn something new. You've only got so much experience you're going to be able to live in your life, and the best way to get more is other people, be it listen to their stories as like a friend or just through their work. And like I feel like that's how you learn more, and that's how you mature more, and that's how you grow more. So again, even if it's not something I like to seek out like actively, like I do with my fucking Superman comics or something, whenever I do get an excuse to read one and it's really, really good, I always have a special place for those hard hitting, emotional, like emotionally honest works, which this falls into.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've been going for quite a while now. Is there anything else you really want to talk about, or do you want to go ahead and wrap up?
Just to kind of bring it full circle, like I mentioned, Jean-Paul Leon's the guy who did the covers for this series, who also died recently, and there's actually a kind of eeriness to some of it, because I was listening to an interview with Mitch Gerrits today that was recorded back in 2016 when this book was coming out, and he was talking about like how excited he was because Jean-Paul Leon was his favorite artist, and that he like spent a lot of time like as a kid not understanding what made him good, and then growing up and like learning the craft of comics art and stuff, and definitively thinking that is his favorite artist. And so having that perspective and having that guy do the covers for your book, and then he just dies like the day we talk about it, or around the time we talk about it, that's kind of eerie and that's sad. And he was the way a lot of the artists in the industry talk about him is that he is like the artist's artist. He's not the guy that like you go to even a comic book store and mention the name of and people know who you're talking about. But you talk to a comic book artist or anyone who's into the art scene, and they'll know exactly who you're talking about, because all of his work it's minimal, it's subtle, it requires a kind of care and a craft that's difficult and isn't something that you see every day, especially in just like major big two books. And he's also the kind of artist that was a lot bigger in Europe because he's got more of a European style, despite being like a dude living in Texas. So I really like that as like a fun little historical time capsule, just in terms of the creators knowing each other. And I think the point is pretty apt, where like you look at any of the Sheriff of Babylon covers, and unless you're someone that's like actually into the art scene, it's hard to tell what makes this any more special than anything else. But then you go through that guy's work and try to like break down what he was doing with the dark lines and the inks and what figures have details and which ones don't, and suddenly it's like, wow, this took a lot of work and a lot of effort, and it didn't have to be flashy to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's about it.
Okay. All right, I guess we go on to ratings. I will rate Sheriff of Babylon Season 1. 4.5 out of 5. Have you seen 24? I've got the new seasons.
this one, this many thing we've given praise of. 4 out of 5. Thanks.
I'm gonna give it 4.5 out of 5 blown up Saddam Hussein pool houses.
Nice. All right. So, I like I said, I took up the chain and I got permission to do 2 review topics in a row, and I've been fucking living this lately. It's just been like the soundtrack of my life for the last couple weeks, because I've just had it like living in my head rent free. So we're going to talk about Jesus Christ Superstar. In particular, I want to talk about the 1973 film adaptation of it, because that's the version that I like the most. I've been getting YouTube recommends for a 2000 film adaptation that's just awful. But that's neither here nor there. So yeah, we're gonna talk about Jesus Christ Superstar next time. It's gonna be a couple bros just talking about our favorite Christian rock album. That's exactly what this is. Yeah, I know, right? So it should be a good time. Until then, everyone, thanks very much for watching. I'm the Philosopher.
And I am the champion. Press.
I am the Tom King simp.
The Tom King simp. And we are your geeky gentlemen, and we will be discussing things. The Tom King simp should be our official sign-off from now on.
Honestly, yeah, might as well be.